The years 1876 to 1878 cast a long, dark shadow over India's history. This was a time of immense suffering and hardship. This period witnessed the Great Famine, a tragedy of immense proportions. The famine was not just a natural disaster, but a catastrophic event that reshaped the socio-economic fabric of the region. Millions of lives were lost, and countless others were pushed to the brink. The sheer scale of human suffering was unimaginable, with entire communities decimated. Environmental factors played a crucial role, but British colonial policies worsened the situation. The colonial administration's response was inadequate and often exacerbated the crisis. The famine, also known as the Madras famine, affected southern and southwestern India. Regions that were once fertile and prosperous were reduced to barren lands of despair. Conservative estimates place the death toll between 4 to 5 million people. These numbers, though staggering, only tell part of the story. However, some suggest a much higher figure, possibly ranging from 12 to 29 million. The true extent of the tragedy remains a subject of historical debate. This wide range in estimates speaks to the chaos and inadequate record-keeping. The lack of reliable data has made it difficult to fully comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. The Great Famine was part of a larger global food crisis affecting countries across continents. It highlighted the vulnerabilities of agrarian societies to climatic and political upheavals. It stands as a grim testament to the interplay of natural hardship and human policy. The famine underscored the devastating impact of colonial exploitation and mismanagement. The memory of this famine is deeply etched in India's collective consciousness. It serves as a poignant reminder of the resilience and suffering of the people. It fueled the nascent Indian nationalist movement, critiquing British rule. The famine became a rallying point for those advocating for self-governance and justice. The primary trigger for the Great Famine was a severe failure of the monsoons. The monsoon rains, which were the lifeblood of Indian agriculture, failed to arrive as expected, leading to a catastrophic chain of events. India's agriculture was heavily dependent on seasonal rains. Without the monsoons, the fields remained parched, and the crops that millions relied on for sustenance could not grow. The monsoon failures in 1876 were particularly acute across large parts of the Deccan Plateau and southern India. These regions, already vulnerable due to their reliance on rain-fed agriculture, were hit the hardest. This led to widespread crop failures and dwindling food stocks. The granaries, which should have been filled with the season's harvest, were empty, and the fields lay barren. Scientific research indicates that Asia experienced one of its worst droughts in centuries. The climatic conditions were unprecedented, and the impact was felt across the continent. The drought conditions persisted, creating a cumulative effect. Each passing month without rain compounded the suffering, as the land became increasingly inhospitable. Water sources dried up, livestock perished, and the land became barren. Rivers and wells that once provided life-giving water were reduced to cracked earth and dust. These environmental factors were the initial spark. The failure of the monsoons set off a chain reaction that would devastate the region. However, the extent of the suffering cannot be attributed solely to the failure of the rains. The human cost was exacerbated by other factors. The policies of the British colonial power played a significant role in turning this environmental crisis into a human tragedy. Their response, or lack thereof, to the unfolding disaster was critical. The societal and political structures in place exacerbated the situation. The colonial administration's priorities and policies often ignored the needs of the local population, worsening the impact of the famine. Modern climate science has identified an exceptionally strong El Niño event as a key factor. El Niño disrupts weather patterns worldwide, often leading to droughts. The El Niño event of 1877 to 78 was one of the strongest recorded. This powerful El Niño brought unusually warm and dry conditions to India. The warming in the Pacific Ocean weakened the monsoonal winds, reducing rainfall. This disruption exacerbated the existing drought conditions. The transition from a strong La Niña to an exceptionally strong El Niño created a volatile climatic situation. These natural events set the stage for severe food shortages. The human response to the crisis, however, was a matter of policy and choice. At the time of the Great Famine, India was under British colonial rule. The administration, headed by Viceroy Lord Lytton, adhered to laissez-faire principles. This doctrine advocated minimal government intervention even during severe food scarcity. The colonial government focused on maintaining law and order and revenue collection. Decision-making was centralized and slow, with local officials constrained by higher policies. The emphasis was on fiscal prudence, avoiding excessive expenditure on relief. The colonial administration lacked a deep understanding of Indian rural society. Traditional coping mechanisms were weakened under colonial rule, increasing vulnerability. One of the most criticized aspects was the continued export of food grains from India, even during times of severe famine and widespread hunger. Despite widespread crop failures, the colonial administration prioritized food exports, driven by the economic interests of the British Empire. In the famine year of 1877-78, India exported a record amount of wheat. This was a time when millions of Indians were starving, yet the grain was shipped overseas. This policy was driven by profit and the demands of the British market, which saw India as a source of cheap raw materials and foodstuffs. Official relief measures were grossly inadequate and poorly managed. The relief camps were often overcrowded and lacked basic necessities. The temple wage, a system where laborers were paid minimal wages, offered insufficient food or money for hard labor. This left many workers weak and malnourished. The colonial government's commitment to laissez-faire principles meant a refusal to intervene significantly in the grain markets, even during times of crisis. Traders hoarded grain and prices soared beyond the reach of the poor. This exacerbated the suffering of those already struggling to survive. The existing land revenue systems and taxation policies had already impoverished many Indian farmers, leaving them with little to no reserves. The relentless demand for revenue forced farmers to sell their produce immediately after harvest, often at low prices, to meet tax obligations. These underlying economic vulnerabilities were cruelly exposed by the drought, which devastated crops and left millions without food or income. The human impact of the Great Famine was catastrophic. Estimates of the death toll vary widely, from 5 to 29 million. Entire villages were depopulated and the countryside was littered with bodies. People abandoned their homes in search of food and water. Mass migrations occurred, with little solace found in relief camps. Social norms and traditional bonds were frayed under extreme pressure. The famine devastated the agricultural economy, with vast numbers of cattle perishing. Many small farmers lost their land, leading to increased landlessness and rural indebtedness. The psychological trauma inflicted upon the survivors was profound. The perceived indifference of the colonial rulers bred deep anger and disillusionment. The famine exposed the stark realities of colonial exploitation. The Great Famine became a powerful catalyst for Indian nationalism. The immense suffering and perceived apathy of the colonial government fueled anger. Indian intellectuals and emerging political leaders questioned British rule. Prominent thinkers like Dadabhai Naoroji and Ramesh Chandra Dutt documented the economic impact of British policies. The famine provided stark evidence for the drain theory, highlighting colonial exploitation. The shared experience of suffering fostered a sense of national unity. The Great Famine followed a grim pattern of mass starvation under British rule. A significant precursor was the Orissa famine of 1866, which claimed over 1 million lives. The response was marked by slow recognition, adherence to laissez-faire principles, and inadequate relief. The recurrence of devastating famines led nationalist critics to argue that colonial policies increased India's vulnerability. Heavy land revenue demands and lack of investment in irrigation projects were points of contention. Viceroy Lord Lytton's administration echoed the mistakes made in Orissa. This pattern of neglect solidified the nationalist argument against British rule. The Great Famine profoundly shaped India's history and its path towards independence. The immense suffering galvanized the Indian nationalist movement. The famine laid bare the exploitative nature of colonialism. Famine codes were developed outlining procedures for relief and prevention. The famine contributed to global discussions about poverty and development. Understanding historical droughts and famines is vital for predicting future climate-related crises. Modern India has made significant strides in famine prevention, but challenges persist. The lessons from the Great Famine emphasize the need for proactive government intervention and robust social safety nets.